And we'd also, oh, somebody's recording. Got it. Thank you, whoever did that. I meant to turn that on. Thank you. We'd ask you all to stay on mute for the duration of the event, but feel free to keep your camera on or off, whatever your preference is there. So Dr. David Forsythe is University Professor of Political Science Emeritus at UNL. He received his PhD at Princeton University and joined the faculty at UNL in 1973, where he served as the department chair between 1993 and 1998. He's been recognized by several professional organizations for his pioneering studies in human rights and humanitarian affairs. He is the founding director of the UNL Interdisciplinary Program in Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. Tonight, Dr. Forsythe will examine the clash between Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, which has roiled world affairs for about a century now. So welcome, Dr. Forsythe.
Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Good. First, let me thank you, your side, for that very nice, polite stalling while we worked out the technical glitches, and thank you for this invitation. I should like to make just a couple of preliminary points. First of all, I'm not a historian. I'm a historically oriented political scientist who has studied international relations for a long time. I do not present myself as a Middle East expert, but I have followed this issue rather closely for about 50 years. So I have some views on it. I have worked in the area directly some decades ago. I do not see myself as an advocate for either side. I see myself as one very much interested in the history of things. I wouldn't claim to be totally objective, and people on this subject in particular frequently see a bias. But again, I repeat, I would give the same talk in a synagogue as in a church, as in a mosque. I would give the same talk. So there you have it. And with that, I'll plunge right in and make a few remarks, and then we can later have some Q&A. And I'm sure there might be some historical point that will come up that I'm not familiar with. And all I can do is promise to look it up and get back to you. So with that, let me start with a focus on the Zionist movement, and then I'll take up Palestinian nationalism. But let me start with a focus on the Zionist movement. And it's a story that's, I think, going to be familiar to many Americans. You have, in the Western world, persistent discrimination against Jews. You have persistent anti-Semitism. A couple of classic examples will be a fabrication by the Tsarist secret police called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is a fantastical story about Jews drinking the blood of Christian children and all of that. It's a complete fabrication based on anti-Semitism in the old Russian Empire. You have the Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jewish member of the military is falsely accused of treason and put on trial. So in Russia, in France, in most of the countries of the Western world, you have anti-Semitism, you have persecution, you have pogroms, violent attacks on Jews because they are Jews. The United States has not been immune to anti-Semitism. In the 1930s, there was a Catholic priest, Canadian actually, but broadcasting on the radio out of Detroit, Father Calhoun. He had a very big radio audience of about 30 million people. At that time, the population of the US was about, I don't know, 120 million. He had 30 million people. and he was openly anti-Semitic, Catholic anti-Semitic. Henry Ford, anti-Semitic, paid to circulate anti-Semitic tracts attacking Jews because they were Jews. So you have this all across the Western world. And as a result of this widespread anti-Semitism, you have the start of the Zionist movement based in Europe. Theodor Herzl is the mover and shaker of the early Zionist movement. And it was a belief that Jews could never be safe unless they had their own nation. That even though they might think they're assimilated as Americans or Germans or French or Russians or Poles or whatever, the heart of the Zionist movement is the belief that Jews can never be safe and secure unless they have their own nation. And that was the start of the Zionist movement in reaction to the facts of widespread persecution. And I was struck to read not too long ago that even after the Holocaust, after the Germans had tried to physically exterminate the Jews of Europe, at the end of World War II, there were a number of Jewish refugees who found themselves in Berlin, mainly in the American sector of occupation and the British sector of occupation. And they were stuck there because even after the Holocaust, Western countries did not want to accept Jewish refugees, even after the Holocaust. In fact, one of the reasons that Hitler turned to genocide of the Jews was that his effort to deport all of them didn't work because, again, other countries did not want to take in very many Jewish citizens. And so he turned to genocide because the effort to create a living space for Germans and expel the Jews, deport the Jews, didn't work to his satisfaction. So he turned to genocide, the intentional intent to kill groups of people or a substantial part of people. We can talk about the definition of genocide later. So you have persecution. It's very widespread in the Western world. And it leads to the Zionist movement, which doesn't want to create a Jewish national home in Uganda or any place else. It wants to create a Jewish national home, the core area of which would be old Judea and Samaria, where there were Jewish kingdoms before these Jewish kingdoms were crushed by the Roman Empire. And so when the Zionist movement gets started in Europe, congresses in Basel and Vienna and other places, the focus is always on what became British Western Palestine, which was a mandate under the League of Nations after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Zionist movement was dedicated, it was focused, and it was very good at politics. They developed very good relations with the British government, which was then, back in the early part of the 20th century, a major colonial power, a major power and a major colonial power. And because of those very good and close political connections, in the United Kingdom, you get the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which is the British government promising to create in what was then British Palestine, or soon to be British Palestine, a national home for the Jewish people as long as the civil rights of Arabs were protected. Balfour Declaration, 1917, promising a national home for the Jewish people as long as the civil rights of the Arabs were protected. But there was no mention of political rights of Arabs, only the civil rights. So you have the Balfour Declaration. And the British wind up under the League of Nations, really being a kind of soft colonial power in the sense that they're not called a colonial power, but they are given a mandate to rule parts of the Middle East. In effect, they give themselves a mandate to rule parts of the Middle East. And in 1921, with this very large British mandate for Palestine, which includes what is now Jordan, they slice off Jordan. They create Transjordan in 1921. The British create Transjordan in 1921, which then leaves that part of the British mandate of Palestine covering from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, covering what is now Israel and the West Bank and Gaza and all of that. So what you have in the 1930s and 40s is basically a civil war for control of British Western Palestine between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And the British wind up being caught in the middle between the emerging Arab nationalism and the Zionist movement, armed with the Balfour Declaration, where the British promise to create a national home for the Jewish people. But without consulting and without taking into serious account the majority of the population in British Western Palestine, which is overwhelmingly Arab. But the Jews, the Zionist movement, the Jewish leadership of the Zionist movement is quite effective. They're very good at politics. They get the Balfour Declaration. And then when the British, having made promises to everybody in sight about the future of Palestine, basically quit and walk away and say, well, we can't handle this anymore. We have Arab violence against Jews. We have Jewish violence against Arabs. We can't control things. World War II has exhausted us. And so the British leave and walk away from the future of Palestine, meaning British Western Palestine. And the fighting intensifies, the violence intensifies. And Britain effectively turns everything over to the United Nations. But when you say the United Nations, and I heard, I guess it was your president talking about, well, she heard something about the United Nations and she wasn't maybe too clear on what all that meant. The power within the United Nations is held by states. So when the British walked away from the mandate of Palestine, which they had accepted after World War I and tried to manage and mismanaged and failed to kind of muddle through in any effective way, the British said, the UN, you take it over. But when you talk about the UN, you're talking about the state members of the UN. They're the ones that have the votes. They're the ones that have the power. In this sense, the United Nations is a kind of framework. It's a kind of stage. And the states in the UN General Assembly adopt the partition resolution recommending the division of British Western Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And you have lots of talk diplomatically about the importance of the Balfour Declaration and the UN partition resolution. But in 1948, as the British give up and withdraw, the state of Israel is created through force of arms. There's a war. Yes, you have diplomacy. You have this study, and you have that study, and you have this recommendation, and that recommendation, and you have the Balfour Declaration, and you have the UN Partition Resolution. But basically, the State of Israel is created in 1948 through violent struggle, through war. The Israelis call it their War of Independence. The Palestinians call it the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe. Because they lose, the Zionist movement wins. The Zionist movement had agreed to accept the partition resolution, which was very controversial within the Zionist movement. We can go into some of those splits and divisions within the Zionist movement. I've said that the leaders of the Zionist movement were very dedicated and focused and determined and politically quite shrewd, but there were divisions and there were disagreements. And one of the disagreements was whether to accept a small state of Israel, which they had been able to create by war in 1948, or hold out for a larger Israel for all of British Western Palestine. And so that was one of the splits in the Zionist movement, whether to take half a loaf, because it's better than no loaf, or whether to hang on and fight for an even larger Jewish state. They accepted half a loaf. They accepted a rather small state of Israel in what had been British Western Palestine. And Jordan, actually, created by the British, with a government installed by the British, Jordan actually moved in and took part of Jerusalem and the West Bank. And in fact, the Arab state of Jordan, first of all, stood up to the armed Zionist movement and said, you can't go any further, basically, in 1949. And then Jordan itself tried to hold on to East Jerusalem and the West Bank area, which was a kind of collusion between Jordan and Israel to block the emergence of a Palestinian state. That, in a nutshell, a very quick sort of, I might say, history for dummies, myself being a dummy, a very quick kind of overview of the Zionist movement, reaction to anti-Semitism, building close relations, first with the British and then with the Americans, and through their own force of arms, able to create the State of Israel in 1948. Things look, well, let me conclude this little superficial overview of the Zionist movement by saying that the image projected out of all of this, particularly to the Americans, because the Zionist movement understood that the Americans were replacing the British as the major power in this area. The whole presentation, the whole image was that here you had a small democratic state that was a refuge for persecuted people, standing up to autocratic Arab governments and backward peoples. And this kind of projection of the image of the Zionist movement and the image of the new state of Israel, I think you'd have to say in political terms was quite effective. And there are a number of Americans today who think of Israel as a small liberal democratic state existing in a very tough neighborhood and deserving of outside support. Things look very different if you then trace Palestinian nationalism and you talk about Palestinian nationalism rather than the Zionist movement. You have in the Arab world in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s an active resistance to Western colonialism. You have an active Arab movement to get rid of the British and get rid of the French, the two major powers who hold mandates in the Middle East under the League of Nations. And you have the recognition of independence for Syria, Lebanon, Iraq in the 1920s and 30s, Jordan, recognized as independent in 1921, even if sort of controlled behind the scenes by the British. I mean, even after independence in Iraq, the British are still trying to control things. And even after independence in Syria and Lebanon, the French are trying to control things. But the point is that these other parts of the Arab world were obtaining their independence at the very time that the Palestinians were denied national independence and self-determination. Iraq got its state, Syria got its state, Lebanon got its state, Jordan got its state. Egypt was already a recognized state. And Palestinian nationalism was blocked. Palestinian nationalism was thwarted in part by the Zionist movement and the British, but in part because of the internal weaknesses of the Palestinian community. And there are Palestinian intellectuals who write about the weaknesses of the Palestinian national leadership, 20s, 30s, especially the 40s, even thereafter. And I would say, and here I'm not speaking legally and I'm not speaking morally, I'm just speaking politically, the Zionist movement was better at power politics than was the leaders of the Palestinian community. You had a number of Palestinian leaders who thought if they just pointed out the justness of their cause, if they just pointed out that they were a majority of the population in British Western Palestine, that would be enough. And they didn't organize politically the way the Zionist leaders did. They didn't develop the contacts in London. They didn't develop the contacts in Washington that the Zionist leaders did. And so, as we all know, the Palestinians never got their state. Palestinians never got their state as a kind of living reality on the ground in what had been part of British Western Palestine. It is said that the Palestinian leaders should have accepted the partition resolution. The Zionist movement did. And by accepting the partition resolution, plus their own political capabilities, they got the Jewish state. The Palestinians rejected the partition resolution and decided to sort of continue the fight. And people criticized the Palestinian leadership for this decision in 1947, 1948 to reject the partition resolution because they wound up with no state. This is a very difficult situation. I can think of two interesting comparisons. Why do we have a Republic of Ireland today? Why do we have the Irish Republic as a sovereign independent state, member of the UN, exchange ambassadors with everybody, etc.? We have an Irish state. They compromised and agreed that the northern counties in Ireland would be British. The Northern Ireland is British. The northern half of that island is part of the United Kingdom. And then you have the Republic of Ireland in the south. So there was a very tough compromise. There was a very tough compromise. And of course, there was some violence thereafter, but you did finally get an Irish state carved out of the United Kingdom. But it was not what a lot of the Irish Republicans wanted, but they compromised and they opted for half a loaf. Ukraine now faces the same difficult choice. Should Ukraine make peace with Russia at the price of Ukraine losing Crimea and the Donbass region? Should Ukraine get the Russians to stop bombing Ukraine at the price of a compromise in which Russian aggression is rewarded and Russia retains control of Crimea and the eastern provinces loosely called the Donbass? Same sort of difficult junctures arise in other national movements about a pragmatic compromise where you recognize you don't have the power to get everything you want, so you take a deal, you take a partial agreement, it's unsatisfying. But anyway, in 47, 48, and later in 1967, the Palestinians and their supporters decided to keep on fighting and tried to eliminate the Jewish state that existed. And in general, I think one can say that the Palestinians over time became worse off and worse off. And then you get the debate of, well, they should have accepted the partition resolution and worked out some sort of compromise sharing British Western Palestine. In fact, I alluded to this earlier, there was part of the Zionist movement that was opposed to the partition resolution and wanted a greater Israel instead of a smaller Israel. Those people existed in the Zionist movement, and they still exist today. They still exist today. They are, in fact, part of the coalition headed by Bibi Netanyahu. There are parts of the Israeli government that are still committed to creating a greater Israel and are not really satisfied with the smaller Israel that they got from 1948 and then expanded in 1967. It should be said, I think, in talking about Palestinian nationalism, that a lot of the surrounding Arab governments didn't really care that much about Palestinian nationalism and the Palestinians. A lot of the Arab governments, mostly Sunni rather than Shia, recognized the power of Israel, recognized that Israel was there to stay, were not prepared to suffer costs in blood and money to continue the fight for Arab Palestine. They were not seriously committed to a Palestinian state. Those were Arab governments. I've already talked about Jordan, how Jordan tried to control East Jerusalem and the West Bank and block the development of the Palestinian state between 48 and 67. And then Jordan erroneously, maybe foolishly, decided to support the Arab cause in the 1967 war, which the Israelis call the Six-Day War. And Jordan jumped in with Egypt and Syria and tried to roll back the Jewish state. And Jordan lost the West Bank, and Jordan lost East Jerusalem, and Jordan wound up back where it was before as a small, impoverished Arab state. This is indicative of the fact that a number of the Arab states really didn't care that much about Palestinians and Palestinian nationalism. But that's the governments. The street, the Arab masses, Arab public opinion never forgot about the Palestinians. In Jordan, in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, in other Arab states, now in Yemen, or at least northern Yemen. You have a lot of grassroots support for the Palestinians. So on the Arab side, you have to distinguish between the governments, which maybe didn't care that much about Palestinian nationalism, as long as they got their own nationalism, as long as they got their own state, as long as their own national self-determination was recognized, and looking at the power of Israel. A lot of the Arab governments said, well, enough is enough, let's move on. And this is why you have the Abraham Accords. This is why you have recent deals between Israel and Egypt and Jordan, first of all, and then potentially Israel and Saudi Arabia, although that's receded now, and deals between Egypt and UAE and Qatar. You have these other Arab governments saying, well, look, Israel's there, it's powerful, it's got technology, we can do trade, we can do tourism. A lot of Israelis want to visit, they want to travel. That's Arab governments. But the Arab masses, in general, big sweeping generalization, Arab masses remember the Nakba. They remember what they call the disaster of 1948, and they are very sympathetic to the Palestinians. And you see that now today. So much so that the Arab governments have had to back off from normalization with Israel. And now they're back, these Arab governments are back to talking about the need for a Palestinian state. Most crucially, Saudi Arabia now says, well, we can't continue with normalization of Israel unless there are concrete signs toward moving toward a Palestinian state. In general, the Palestinian side, Palestinian leaders, Palestinian community has been divided, has suffered from a lack of bold, creative leadership, I would say in general, particularly when compared to the focus and determination of the Zionist movement and the Israeli leaders, who particularly have built bridges to Western governments like the United States. And the United States recognized Israel very quickly in 1948. And from about 1970 became the main weapons supplier to Israel. And now Israel gets more foreign assistance from the United States than any other recipient of US foreign assistance. So the Israeli leaders and the leaders of the Zionist movement are very good about developing relations with powerful Western governments, first the British and then the Americans. And the Palestinians, not as effective politically, relied more on the appeals to morality and law and the justness of their cause. And that's sort of the background, in a nutshell, of a quick introduction to the Zionist movement and also the nature of Palestinian nationalism. There's a lot more to be said. We can talk about the various uprisings by the Palestinians to protest their lack of a state in the Middle East. You had the first Intifada, or uprising. You had the second Intifada. And just now we've watched the attacks by Hamas, October 7th, on Kibbutzim in southern Israel near the Gaza border. There is a pattern here, which is very important, I think, for talking about this subject. And that is Israel has sought security by denying recognition to a Palestinian state. So Israel has sought security through domination, and they are the strongest military power in that part of the world. But sooner or later, that has always provoked an outburst of violence, mostly by the Palestinians themselves. In 1967, you had other states trying to roll back. In 1967, you had the Egypt and Syria in particular trying to roll back the state of Israel and create a Palestinian state. But since then, since 1967, with the exception of 1973, the Palestinians themselves have undertaken violence to try to make the world remember them. Perhaps you've heard of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO for a long time, leader of Al-Fatah, which was the main organization within the coalition called the PLO. The PLO was originally created by Egypt to control the Palestinians. I, in fact, talked in Cairo with Ahmad Shukeri, who was the first leader of the PLO. He was totally worthless. He was totally useless. He was created by the Egyptians to represent the Palestinians and do nothing. But after the victory of Israel in 1967 and the crushing defeat of Egypt and Syria and Jordan and so forth in the 67 war, Yasser Arafat and others took over the PLO for the Palestinians. And they began to hijack airplanes and use violence against civilians. And of course, we called all that terrorism. But nothing was happening to create a Palestinian state through diplomacy, and so there was violence. And again, I mentioned the first intifada or uprising. I guess it was 87, and the second intifada in something like 99. And along the way, you had the Oslo Accords. President Clinton mediated an attempted agreement to create some kind of Palestinian entity to go along with the state of Israel. And that was the effort that got Rabin assassinated. Rabin, the Israeli prime minister who signed the Oslo Accords, was assassinated by a far-right Israeli who objected to any recognition of a Palestinian collectivity or a Palestinian entity. In my opinion, the Oslo Accords were highly favorable to Israel and didn't give the Palestinians much at all. There were two versions of the Oslo Accords in 93 and then 95. So even that kind of weak recognition of some kind of Palestinian collectivity provoked a violent backlash on the Israeli right wing, which led to the assassination of Rabin. And since that time, since his assassination in 95, there hasn't been much promising diplomacy about creating a Palestinian state. And so we get Hamas, and we get Islamic Jihad, and we get support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and we get the terrible violence, the murders, the rapes, the decapitations, just the terrible violence of October 7th, because once again, the Palestinians feel that they are being neglected, they are being ignored, that playing nice doesn't get you anything, and you have to undertake violence. We've seen this pattern before. And as a political fact, everybody now is talking about the possibilities of a Palestinian state. Before October 7th, that was not a leading diplomatic issue. So I think probably that's enough as a superficial introduction. You have the Zionist movement, which is successful in creating a Jewish state in old British Western Palestine. And there never was an Arab Palestinian state. There might have been, there could have been, there should have been. It didn't happen. And that's the situation we find ourselves in today. And I think probably everybody's tired of hearing me and probably has 100 or 200 questions.
So we have a couple things in the chat, but like I said, if you want to ask a question, please pop it in the chat and I will facilitate it to David. So the first one was, are Palestinians a Semite people or are they considered Arab?
I think the answer to that would be that they are considered a Semitic Arab Eastern people. They are non-Western. And for a long time, particularly under the Ottoman Empire, which lasted 400 years in this part of the world, you had local Jews and local Arabs and local Christians existing side by side. There were a number of Jews who spoke Arabic, who spoke Turkish. They might have also spoken Hebrew or Yiddish, depending. But you would have in the Palestinian community a non-Western Semitic Arab people who got along with Jews for centuries because there was no political threat there. For 400 years, the Ottomans allowed a lot of local autonomy. And as long as people paid their taxes and didn't make a lot of problems for Istanbul, things went along, and the local Arabs and the local Jews got along reasonably well because the Zionist movement had not penetrated the area, and you didn't have a threat to loss of Arab domination. You didn't have threats to attempted Palestinian self-determination because the Ottomans were in control, or before that, somebody else was in control, and the local Arabs and Jews more or less got along until the whole question of who is going to rule the territory, who is going to replace the British. When that question arose, then you had conflict, and you had violence by both sides. You had Zionist attacks on civilians. You had Arab attacks. You had Palestinian attacks on non-combatant Jews. You had, on the Zionist side, you had the Stern Gang and the Irgun killing women, children, the elderly. And you had the same thing on the Arab side, attacking Jewish civilians. Once the whole thing got politicized, and once 1930s and 1940s, the political struggle came to the fore about who was going to be in control of this part of the world.
We had somebody ask if you could elaborate on Nakba.
Yeah, well, again, I think the Palestinians consider it a great disaster because it was in the late 1940s that while the other Arab states were being recognized as independent, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and so forth, the Palestinians lost out. And you had, from the first Arab-Israeli war in 1948, 1949, you had something like 750,000 Palestinian refugees. Some of them fled the fighting. Some of them, however, were forced out in intentional ethnic cleansing. Israeli historians have documented coercive expulsion of a number of Arabs from what is now Tel Aviv, neighboring Jaffa, other areas. So all of this together, the creation of the Jewish state, the denial of a Palestinian state, the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, which we read about now in Gaza because a number of the refugees from 1948 went into Gaza. They also went into Jordan, they went into Lebanon, they went into Syria, a few went into Egypt, many went into Gaza. All of that together, from the Palestinian point of view, is a great catastrophe, a great disaster, 1948, 1949.
Thank you for that elaboration, David. Another question is, a severe occupation of Palestinians has not been mentioned, lack of freedom, lack of rights. Could that be addressed here?
Sure, and it should be, and that's a very good question. Occupation itself is not illegal. Occupation occurs when a fighting party finds itself in control of new territory and continues to rule that territory. And if you look at the laws of war, there is something called the Fourth Geneva Convention from 1949, which pertains to occupied territory. So Israel, particularly after 1967, when it won the Six-Day War, took a lot more territory. From the point of view of international lawyers, from the point of view of the UN General Assembly, from the point of view of an organization that I study, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Geneva, Israel control of the West Bank and Gaza is occupied territory, which initially was not illegal. But then the question arises, if you continue to occupy for 50 or 75 years, does occupation become colonialism? If you stay in control of foreign territory and you restrict the population and you don't give them equal rights, you don't give them the same rights that you have within Israel, is that not a different situation from a kind of short-term occupation? You have this also in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has taken territory that until 2014 was regarded as Ukrainian. The Russians took all of Crimea and took part of the Donbass. From the point of view of Ukraine, from the point of view of international lawyers, this is occupied territory. It is still, if you take a legal approach, it's still Ukrainian. It is just occupied by Russia. But Russia has annexed Crimea and most of the Donbass. And so Russia says this is no longer occupied territory. This is now part of Russia. Sort of in the same way, Israel has annexed part of the territory, but only part of the territory it took in 1967, and now on the Golan Heights next to Syria and Lebanon, Israel says this is part of Israel now. And most of the rest of the world says, no, it's still occupied territory. So you do get the question of occupation. It's a difficult question to deal with because, again, immediately after a war, occupied territory is not illegal. It's a legal condition resulting from the war. But if it lasts, if it endures, and if the occupying power represses and discriminates and abuses, does it become colonialism? Does it become apartheid? Does it become apartheid because the inhabitants of the West Bank, the inhabitants of the Gaza, are treated in an inferior way and don't have the same rights and liberties that you see elsewhere? But yes, there is the whole debate about the status of occupied territory and the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention from 1949, and all of that is part of the current controversy.
Another question, can you share insights regarding the willingness of Hamas to sacrifice civilians in the battle against Zionist state?
Yeah, I can give an opinion on that. I can give my take on that. And that is that, and it's an important point wherever you come down on this. Hamas has clearly made life worse for the people in Gaza, and also, for that matter, the people in the West Bank. In attacking the southern communities in Israel on October 7th, one could anticipate a very brutal, broad Israeli response, particularly in Gaza, where Hamas is effectively the local government, and even the West Bank, which is supposedly under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. So you have Hamas ruling Gaza, Palestinian Authority ruling the West Bank. One could anticipate after October 7th a very harsh and broad Israeli response, and that's what we've seen. From the Israeli point of view, Hamas brought this on, let's say, the people in Gaza by doing what it did on October 7th, by intertwining its military operations with the civilian population, by creating tunnels all throughout Gaza in civilian neighborhoods and near or under hospitals or whatever. Hamas put Palestinians in Gaza in harm's way. And particularly from the Israeli point of view, or one of the Israeli points of view, if Hamas had really been concerned about the welfare of the Palestinians in Gaza, it would not have done what it did, because one could anticipate a very forceful Israeli response. On the other hand, and this is in no way meant to justify the horrific attacks by Hamas on Israelis on October the 7th, in many cases, we see that violence has a political purpose. You see this in Myanmar, which is Burma, old Burma, where you have a military junta which overthrew Aung San Suu Kyi and locked her up again. And so you have a violent pushback against that military coup. And the future of Myanmar is now very much up for grabs because of violence. The Irish were able to finally throw off British rule in the Irish Republic. How? Through use of violence, and make it so costly and painful for the British to try to stay in what is now the Republic of Ireland. And so sometimes very atrocious violence serves a political purpose, because once again, in Washington, in other places, one is now talking about the possibility of a Palestinian state. And shouldn't there be some recognition of Palestinian self-determination in one form or other? And that discussion had really not existed between the Oslo Accords in 93, 95 and the attacks of October 7th.
So along the lines with the attacks on October 7th, we had actually a question from someone that said, has anyone provided proof of the 10/7 allegations by Israel? There's some discussion underneath of it that some of the attacks have been proven wrong. I don't know if you have any comment on that, David.
In general, I don't think there's much doubt about what happened on August 7th. Maybe there's some controversy about certain details. But in terms of the maybe around 1,200 people killed, most of them civilians, in terms of the taking of over 200 hostages as shields and bargaining weapons, in terms of some rapes, some decapitations, I don't think there's the slightest doubt that those sorts of things happened.
So we had another question. Could you comment on major colonial powers creating Israel as European/US people colonizing a number of native peoples in Palestine?
Yes, a standard Palestinian view, and I should have brought this out, is that what's been going on is a kind of settler colonialism on the part of the Zionist movement that is really not different from American history or Canadian history or Australian history or New Zealand history, in which Europeans come in, push the indigenous population off their traditional lands, and create a new society, which may be some form of democracy, which may be, according to some definitions, more developed, more advanced than the old societies. But I think if you look at American history, you had Europeans coming into the East Coast, pushing the Cherokee and others off the land, the Iroquois and so forth. And when you get to this part of the world, you know about the Indian Wars. You have the Oto and the Sioux and the Dakota and all of that were progressively pushed aside. It was ethnic cleansing. It was cultural genocide. It was not physical. It was not simple physical genocide. There were some genocidal incidents, but it was not physical genocide. But in any event, outsiders came in and pushed the locals off the land and created a new society and dominated and made the original indigenous people as having an inferior existence. And in a way, from the Palestinian point of view, that's exactly what happened in what used to be British Western Palestine, with the exception of the lapse of time. So if you take the United States as a counterpoint, you have this process of Europeans coming in, pushing the original inhabitants off their traditional lands. And all of that was considered acceptable in the 18th century, 1776, whatever date you want to use. But in 1948, 1930s and 40s, the acceptability of colonialism was on the way out. French tried to hang on, the British tried to hang on, the Dutch tried to hang on, the Portuguese did hang on until the 1970s. Sort of Angola and Mozambique were the last to go. But there was a kind of settler colonialism, which had been seen throughout history, particularly in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century. But in British Palestine, in the 30s and 40s, colonialism was waning as an acceptable mode of operation. And the emphasis on national self-determination was increasing, which is why the fate of the Palestinians was so much a disaster, because in other parts of the world, the colonials were being forced out or partially forced out. And if you want to call it third world nationalism was more and more acceptable, it was in this context that you had the failure of Palestinian self-determination.
Press interviews of people in Gaza and the West Bank show that Hamas has still has a lot of support. In fact, more support than before the latest conflict. Can you explain that situation?
That's a very good point. One might think that with the Hamas attacks of October 7th and then the terrible destruction of the Israeli response in Gaza, that the people in Gaza would say, this is terrible, Hamas has to go, Hamas is not really looking after our own best interest, we're worse off now, given what Hamas did, than before. It has not played out that way. And even on the West Bank, Hamas is more popular than before October. The Palestinian Authority used to try to suppress Hamas in the West Bank, and now the Palestinian Authority kind of has its security people organizing, protecting marches in favor of Hamas. I think from the Palestinian side, there's a broad feeling that anyone who resists Israeli domination and Israeli occupation and Israeli control is to be supported. I think there's a very broad feeling in Gaza, interestingly enough, also in the West Bank, which has not been under the direct control of Hamas. There is an outpouring of support for Hamas.
We have a question from Mina. The Reverend Dr. Mary Jensen served as assistant bishop to our bishop in Palestine. She spoke to our Welka group many years ago about the terrible treatment of Palestinians by the Israelis, yet no one has made any attempts to protect the Palestinians. Can you tell me why?
There have been attempts to protect the Palestinians. Maybe they haven't been very effective. Maybe they haven't been strong enough. I mentioned earlier, I study the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the original Red Cross agency. And it has a loose connection with the American Red Cross and the British Red Cross and all the other Red Cross, Red Crescent societies. It has a loose connection with the Palestinian Red Crescent, for example. The ICRC, ever since 1967, has been doing prison visits in Israel and the occupied territories. The ICRC not only conducts prison visits to check on the treatment of detainees held by Israel, it checks on the treatment of detainees held by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So there are efforts to protect Palestinians. And you have the long history of UNRWA, 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 which is the UN agency that provides social services to the Palestinians. And ever since 1949, 1950, 51, You have UNRWA providing schools and healthcare and other social services to Palestinians in Gaza, on the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, to a lesser extent in Egypt. And so there are efforts, and now the United States is sort of working both sides of the street in that it is saying, on the one hand, that Israel has the right to self-defense, and we continue with military assistance and foreign assistance to Israel. And there's another bill in Congress with some more money for Israel, tied in with money for Ukraine. We have to see if that gets through the House. But you have the US putting sanctions on certain Israeli settlers in the West Bank area who've been shooting at or killing or harassing Palestinians in the West Bank. And the Biden administration has put economic sanctions on some of these individuals that it can identify as abusing Palestinians in the West Bank. So there are these various attempts at trying to lighten the burden of Palestinians who find themselves under Israeli control and domination, but they're not always covered in the Western media, and we don't always hear about some of these activities.
Well, that's why we're here tonight. A term that engenders controversy that is used now by both Palestinians and Israelis is indigenous. Indigenous. Is it accurate to say that both peoples are indigenous to the region?
Some of them are, some of them aren't. You have some Jewish families who have lived there for a long time. It is quite clear that lots of the Palestinians have lived there for hundreds of years. And particularly on the part of the Jews, particularly the Jewish settlers in the West Bank, a lot of these people have grown up in New York or elsewhere, and they've gone to Israel and the occupied territories recently. So some of the Jews are not indigenous, but a good number are. So it depends on which community you're talking about. I think one thing is fairly clear is that both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, there's a very long-standing attachment to the land on both sides, because particularly on the Israeli side, they say, look, there were Jewish kingdoms of Judea and Samaria thousands of years ago, and this was our land before we were forced out by the Romans. So a number of the Jews trace their heritage, if not their immediate family, they trace their heritage back to the Jewish kingdoms of a couple thousand years ago. And so both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side see a very deep attachment to the land in that part of the world.
The October 7th attack was horrific, but what about the war that Israel has been waging since then? This person points out that over 28,000 Gazans have been killed, among them 11,000 children. Over 1.9 million Gazans have been displaced.
Yes, that's exactly right. You have horrific attacks by Hamas, and you have a devastating response by Israel. Legally, the matter is very complex, but I would say morally or politically, in terms of political morality, Israel has incurred a great deal of criticism for the nature of its response, even within the Biden administration, even within the Democratic Party. You have people that are very concerned about the nature of the Israeli response. I say all of this is very complicated legally because under the laws of war, if Hamas uses a hospital for military purposes, that hospital loses its neutral status. If Hamas uses, or Ukraine, uses a civilian apartment building as cover for the launch of a military attack, that civilian structure ceases to be a civilian structure and becomes a permissible military target. So legally, in dealing with the Israeli response, you really have to go into a lot of the grassroots details about who did what where and how long was Hamas using a hospital or a school or a UNRWA facility or whatever. You really have to go into the specifics to try to make a legal judgment about whether the Israeli response was legally justified. But I would say in terms of optics, in terms of images, in terms of a sort of political moral discourse, Israel has suffered a black eye by the nature of its broad destruction in Gaza. Whether it's all a war crime, you can't deal with in generalities. You have to go case by case. And whether, in fact, Israel has rules on a piece of paper that are legal and proper about the nature of its military action, but in fact, its commanders and troops are doing something different. You have to get into the weeds about the details to make those kind of judgments. But in terms of optics and sort of political discourse, I would say both Israel and the United States have suffered greatly because of the very broad destruction of the Israeli response in Gaza. And as you and I know, one can discuss about whether this amounts to genocide or not. And you have a case at the World Court launched by South Africa, charging Israel with creating the possibilities of genocide in Gaza. I was reading a French publication not too long ago, which made the argument, and anybody who knows French will know what I'm talking about, that Israeli policy in Gaza is not genocide, but there are génocidaires in the Israeli government. That is, that the Israeli policy cannot be proven to be genocide, but there are persons in the Israeli government who demean the Palestinians and who have no regard for Palestinian life. And I think it's correct to say that those people do exist at high levels in the Israeli political structure, but that's different from proving the intent to destroy a national people in a court of law. And Israel can say, well, we allow in humanitarian assistance and we have dropped leaflets telling people that we're going to attack and where they should flee. And I think Israel can defend itself in a court of law against charges of genocide. But then in reality, on the ground, is the Israeli response too broad, too destructive? Is it disproportionate? In fact, whatever the rules and regulations adopted by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So it's a complicated issue like everything else.
So I think our last question, David, is given all this information, is it possible that Israel is actually losing the war?
I think Israel is losing the optical war. I think Israel is losing the war over image. I think Israel is losing the war over reputation in many places of the world. I follow the Israeli press a bit, and I think probably the Israeli government still has majority support for pursuing a tough line in Gaza. You know that on the Israeli side, you have the conflict between the people who want to cease fire and bring the hostages out, and the people who say, well, it's more important to eliminate Hamas and keep the war going. And I'm sorry, but we can't make the hostages a priority. So you do have that controversy on the Israeli side, and the Israeli government seems to be committed to continuing to try to eliminate Hamas as much as possible, even if that endangers some hostages. My reading would be that that policy still has majority support in Israel, but in the rest of the world, in the United States, in the Democratic Party, but not the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party, I think, and in American media coverage, I think you have more criticism of Israel than I can remember seeing in my 50 years of following these issues.
Well, I think that's the end of our questions. I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight. If you didn't, just a reminder, if you didn't get your question answered, if you think of one later, please email me. I think Susan will pop my email in the chat, and I'll get David your questions. I just want to thank everybody also, not just for the questions, but for the discussion in the chat. I look forward to being able to delve a little bit deeper into that and click some of those links that I think Andrea was sharing. Thank you for that after the fact. Lastly, of course, I want to thank David for joining us this evening. We appreciate all the discussion. I want to give a shout out to an event that we're going to follow up. So NFP is going to follow this event up. So we've kind of learned the background with an in-person event in Lincoln by President of Peace Action, Kevin Martin, on Thursday, February 29th at 6:30 at Aldersgate United Methodist Church here in Lincoln. You'll be receiving some more details on that event soon. And we obviously hope you'll join us there too. It will also be live streamed for those of you out of town who can't make it on our YouTube channel. And we'll, be there in perpetuity. So I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and don't forget to email me any questions you have.
Just like to say thank you so much for the invitation. It was great to see so many people interested in this subject.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.